I am Heather, a 32-year-old woman. When I was born, my parents seemed reasonably happy, at least on the surface. However, their joy seemed no more than the standard excitement that comes with the arrival of a first child. When I was 3, my mother, Victoria, became pregnant with my brother Jonathan. It was at this point that the dynamics within our home began to shift. It's a boy this time. Anthony, he's definitely going to be great at sports. My mother would often say, her face alight with joy as she caressed her growing belly. From then on, I could feel the smile she once directed at me gradually fading away. Once Jonathan was born, my parents' affection seemed to be channeled exclusively towards him. Even when I would show them a drawing and say, "Mom, look," I was dismissed with a yes later. As Jonathan grew, their blatant favoritism became even more apparent. Jonathan is special. Heather, you're the older sister, so you need to be patient. It was always like this. If Jonathan cried, it was my fault. If Jonathan was selfish, it was expected that I would give in. I gradually learned to suppress my own feelings and live quietly. My only solace was animals. Whenever I went to the local park, I would find stray cats and dogs, feed them, and pet them gently. These animals, asking for nothing in return, were simply there for me. "I want a dog," I once told my parents, only to be met with scoffs. "A dog? We'd rather spend that money on Jonathan's lessons." My wish was never granted. When I grow up, I'll definitely get a dog, I resolved firmly in my mind. As a middle school student, I threw myself into my studies. I had hoped that if I achieved excellent grades, perhaps my parents would acknowledge me. Despite being honored as a top student, their response was minimal, quickly shifting the focus to Jonathan's achievements in sports. Jonathan is doing well in his sports competitions. He's sure to become a great athlete. No matter how hard I tried, I could never become their special child. However, my efforts paid off as I maintained top grades in high school, earned a scholarship, and went on to university. My parents merely said, "That's nice," regarding my education, but by then, I didn't care anymore. Entering university changed my life completely. It was meeting Brandon that made the difference. Brandon was raised in an environment completely opposite to mine. Receiving plenty of love from his parents and growing up carefree, he became someone who could extend kindness to others. "Heather, you're amazing. You've worked so hard to get here on your own." It was the first time someone had truly recognized my efforts. Brandon listened earnestly to my stories and tried to understand my struggles with my parents, without offering unsolicited advice. Eventually, our friendship blossomed into love, and we got married shortly after graduation. After graduating from university, I secured a job at a top-tier company through persistent effort. I worked harder than anyone, consistently delivered results, and received several promotions, eventually being entrusted with a central position in the company. Finally, my longtime dream came true. "Brandon, I want to get a dog." He immediately smiled and agreed. "Of course. It's something you have always wanted, right?" Thus, we welcomed a new family member, Max. Max was not just a pet to me, he symbolized the unconditional love I had always sought. Brandon and Max became my true family, the most precious to me. Even after marrying Brandon, my relationship with my parents remained unchanged. When I announced my marriage to Brandon, my parents showed no interest. They merely responded with an indifferent hum. And didn't even offer any congratulations. They attended the ceremony at the church but never visited our new home. I initially thought they might be busy, but that wasn't the case. When Jonathan married Catherine, my parents threw a lavish party, celebrating with relatives and friends amidst extravagant food and decorations. I attended but felt indescribable emotions. The joy they showed then was never directed at me when I'm married. My mother doted on Jonathan's wife, Catherine, as if she were her own daughter, and my father kindly told her, "Your family now." Seeing this, I could only clutch my glass quietly. Am I not part of the family? I asked myself, though I already knew the answer. I had never been a precious being to my parents. Afterward, I kept a distance from them, minimizing contact and avoiding unnecessary meetings. I realized that their affection was directed toward Jonathan and Catherine, and my efforts would never change that. One day, when Brandon had to go on a sudden week-long business trip, I found myself alone with Max for some quality time. When he left the house, the room instantly became quiet, and my time alone with Max began. While contemplating a visit to the newly opened dog cafe over the weekend, I headed to work as usual. Upon arriving at the office, I was immediately summoned by my boss. Entering the room, my boss began speaking with a serious expression. "I know it's sudden, but I need you to go on a business trip starting tomorrow." I was momentarily stunned by the unexpected request. Despite my confusion, I managed to respond. "A business trip? Tomorrow?" My boss nodded and handed me the schedule. "I'm sorry for the sudden request, but you're the only one I can ask." Those words forced me to take a deep breath. I wasn't mentally prepared for the sudden trip, and with Brandon's trip coinciding, my mind was even more unsettled. The biggest concern was Max. Max was as much a part of the family as anyone, and I had to be cautious about whom I asked to take care of him. Normally, I could rely on pet hotels or sitters, but the trip was decided so abruptly that there was no availability at the usual facilities. Moreover, Max was accustomed to his home environment, and an unfamiliar place could likely stress him out, which I preferred to avoid. I considered asking Brandon's parents, who were always kind and fond of Max, and who always showed concern for us. However, they lived far away, and it felt a bit presumptuous to ask them on such short notice. If they had lived closer, I would have asked them, but expecting them to come over daily during the trip wasn't practical. Although I had several close friends, none had the time to spare for dog care. Finding someone who could reliably manage walks, feeding, and health care on a daily basis wasn't easy. Despite feeling uneasy, I decided to ask my parents to take care of Max. I hadn't been in touch with them for a while, but they lived relatively close by, and I thought, they're family, so they'll probably help if asked. However, this turned out to be a major miscalculation. My mother's response was chillingly cold. "We're not your servants. Don't ask us to do such things." I was at a loss for words. "Servants? I'm just asking for a little help with Max." "No, it's too much trouble," she said dismissively, and I could tell even over the phone that my father was nodding along. I was dumbfounded. Dogs don't listen and aren't even cute. You contacted us after so long just to ask us this. What do you think family is for? Filled with anger and sadness by my mother's words, I hung up without saying anything else. Reluctantly, I looked for a pet hotel with availability and arranged for Max to be taken care of. At that moment, I suppressed my feelings deep inside. Later that year, at Thanksgiving, I was invited to my parents' house along with Brandon. I was reluctant to go because I knew my parents' blatant attitudes, and I had heard that Jonathan and Catherine would also be there. When Jonathan and Catherine arrived, my mother greeted Catherine ecstatically. "Catherine, I'm glad you were able to come. Was it cold outside? Come in quickly." She had never spoken to me with such warmth. Brandon and I exchanged glances and silently took our seats. As the Thanksgiving meal progressed, Jonathan suddenly brought up a topic. "By the way, Mom, Dad, thanks for taking care of our dog last month when we were traveling." "What?" I couldn't help but exclaim. My parents smiled sweetly. "Don't worry about it, Jonathan. It was a pleasure." "He was very affectionate," my mother responded. "He seemed a bit nervous when I dropped him off, but he settled in quickly." "You walked him every day, didn't you?" Jonathan continued. "Especially that golden retriever, he was so attached to Victoria," my father added with a laugh. "Jonathan, if you ever need help with the dog again, we're here for you," my mother said with a smile. At that moment, my mind went blank. They had refused me, saying we're not servants, but they were happy to look after Jonathan's dog? I felt an immediate urge to confront my parents, but wanting to avoid becoming emotional, I held back. After Jonathan and Catherine had left, and we were alone in the quiet living room, the moment finally came. I calmly asked my parents, "What's going on? You refused me saying we are not servants, but why did you take care of Jonathan's dog?" My parents exchanged glances and appeared a bit perplexed. Seeing their reaction, my frustration only grew. I continued, albeit with a restrained voice. "That time, Mom, you ignored my request and said, 'What do you think family is for?'" My mother remained silent, unable to respond. I pressed on, taking a breath. "Why do you do everything for Jonathan, and why am I always treated like this?" As my words echoed in the room, my mother finally looked up and murmured faintly. Jonathan was really in trouble, and I couldn't just ignore him. To us, Jonathan is special. At that moment, years of pent-up anger within me finally erupted. "Don't joke with me. For 5 years, I've been continuously paying the rent for this house. And Jonathan? What has he done?" My mother was momentarily at a loss for words but quickly became defensive. "Jonathan is a boy. We don't want to make a boy struggle." I was left speechless. Ultimately, this was the crux of it all. No matter how hard I worked or how much I gave, I was only ever the convenient daughter to my parents. 5 years ago, my mother said she was unwell and took early retirement from the company she had worked at for many years. However, a month later, my father fell ill. Years of unhealthy living and overwork had taken its toll, and he was diagnosed by doctors as no longer able to do physical labor. He had continued his job at the factory until he collapsed, and since then, he has been unable to work properly. My mother came to me crying about how hard life was. I reluctantly started covering the monthly rent. "What about Jonathan?" I asked. My mother said matter-of-factly, "He's still young. We don't want him to suffer." Jonathan was already a working adult. However, his job was not stable, and Catherine was a stay-at-home wife, so their income was limited compared to ours. Brandon and I both worked full-time and were financially comfortable. Yet, I realized that the amount I was sending had steadily increased. It started with just the rent. But soon it became there's not enough for groceries, there are medical expenses. I want to help Jonathan with his car loan, and one excuse after another for needing more money from me. Still, I continued sending money, thinking it was the least I could do as a filial duty. However, I was never satisfied with my parents' treatment of me. They would demand help us more from me while coddling Jonathan with "don't overdo it." I had always worked hard and fulfilled my responsibilities, yet why was I treated so differently? The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I returned home unable to suppress my anger. Brandon, noticing my state, immediately made some coffee for me. Wrapped in the warm aroma, my feelings gradually settled. Brandon sat silently next to me, simply offering his presence as support. Although we had lived happily until now, I began to reflect a little. Looking back, Jonathan seemed to live carefree without any signs of financial distress every month. He had 2 dogs and often went on trips with Catherine. Considering their lifestyle, it was clear he wasn't struggling financially. Maintaining pets involves costs for food and medical care, and traveling requires significant expenses. Additionally, considering Catherine was a housewife, it was unlikely that Jonathan's income alone could support their lifestyle. I suspected that my parents were giving him money in some way. Without some source of income, such a lifestyle would be impossible. One weekend, I decided to visit my parents' house to uncover the truth. Upon arriving and entering the house, my parents were watching TV in the living room. My mother noticed me but chose to ignore me. My father, seeing me, simply asked, "What's up?" I gathered my courage and quietly started. "I have something I want to ask. What are you using the money I send for?" I inquired. After a pause, my father replied that they were using it to pay rent and utility bills. "I heard from Catherine that you're supporting Jonathan. And his family's living expenses?" I probed further. My mother fell silent for a moment, searching for words. Then, awkwardly averting her eyes, she said, "Just a little. Only when Jonathan was really in trouble. We gave him some." Hearing this, my heart sank rapidly. The doubts and anger I had been harboring seemed ready to explode. Calming myself with a deep breath, I asked, "Why did you do that?" My mother, teary-eyed, responded, "Jonathan was in trouble, and he insisted." It was clear, my parents had been using the money I sent to support Jonathan. I had been foolish. All this time, deep down, I wanted my parents' recognition. But they had never seen me as an equal member of the family. I decided to stop sending money to my parents completely. A few weeks later, after realizing the remittances had stopped, my parents repeatedly contacted me. "Heather, what are you doing? Your father is struggling. Restart the support immediately. We can't pay the rent." But I did not respond. Gradually, their messages changed. "Heather, I'm sorry. But you're our daughter, right? Aren't we family? How can you abandon your father in such a condition?" Still, I remained silent. Just because we're family doesn't mean I need to sacrifice everything. I had finally understood that. After some time, my parents showed up at my house uninvited. When I opened the door, my mother was crying. "Please, Heather. We have no money left. Without you, we can't survive." I responded quietly. "Then, why doesn't Mom get a job? Didn't you say you retired early because you were ill, but you seem healthy, don't you?" My mother's face contorted. "How can you say something so cold?" "Who's being cold? When have you ever helped me when I was in trouble?" My mother started to speak but then stopped, unable to say anything. I no longer hesitated. "I'm not your convenient daughter anymore." And with that, I closed the door. I could hear my mother sobbing, but I did not look back. I completely cut off my parents. I had supported them through many doubts, but they continued to exploit my goodwill. I would not make the same mistake again. However, my parents would not accept this. With the financial support cut off, they were driven into desperation and ultimately took an unbelievable action. One day, as I left work, I received a call from an unknown number. I initially ignored it, but it kept ringing persistently, so I finally answered. "Is this Heather? I am a lawyer representing your parents." For a moment, my thoughts froze. "A lawyer? Your parents are claiming that their lives have become difficult because you have abandoned your duty to support them." I clenched my phone. To think they would go this far. Duty of support? Yes, your parents are elderly with no income, and you have sufficient financial means. Legally, it is unfair to cut off support. Anger welled up inside me. After all the support I had provided, they took it for granted, and the moment I stopped because I reached my limit, they claimed it was my duty. Ridiculous. Understood. I will also hire a lawyer. I immediately contacted Brandon and decided to proceed with legal action. With Brandon's support, I quickly hired a lawyer. I then began organizing all the records of the money I had sent over the years, evidence that I had never asked Jonathan for any help, proof that my mother refused to work despite being able to, and records of unauthorized withdrawals from my bank account by my parents. My lawyer carefully reviewed the documents and came to a conclusion. This could actually be grounds for a countersuit against your parents. I nodded quietly. Weeks later, I faced my parents in court. They looked exhausted but gave me resentful glances. The lawyer methodically proceeded with the case. The plaintiffs are demanding that the defendant fulfill her duty of support. However, the records show that the defendant has provided more than sufficient support. The lawyer quietly submitted the documents. Here are the records of the payments the defendant has made to the plaintiffs over 5 years. The judge's expression turned stern. The lawyer continued. Additionally, there are records of the plaintiffs making unauthorized withdrawals from the defendant's bank account. This could be considered a legal misconduct. My mother's face contorted. But we're family, it should be okay. The judge responded calmly. Even if you are family, it is illegal to use someone else's property without consent. My father turned pale, but my mother continued to resist. A daughter should naturally help her parents. We raised you. I responded clearly. Raising me is not a favor, but a parent's duty. And I have repaid that debt many times. But if that's still not enough, I don't know what is. The judge ultimately dismissed my parents' claims and held them accountable for their misconduct. I had won. After the trial, my parents left the courtroom dejectedly. Jonathan was with them but did not even glance at me. I had cut all ties. My parents and brother no longer mattered to me. I returned home with Brandon to where Max was waiting. As I entered, Max greeted me with a wagging tail. This was my real family. A place where love exists without the need to overextend oneself. A few weeks later, I was told by a doctor in the hospital examination room, smiling. Congratulations. You are 2 months pregnant. For a moment, my mind went blank. Am I going to be a mother? Along with the surprise, a warm feeling spread deep inside me. A new life was growing within me. When I got home and told Brandon, his eyes widened in disbelief before he embraced me. Really? Heather, are we really having a child? I nodded. Yes, our family is going to grow. Tears welled up in Brandon's eyes. Thank you. Heather, thank you so much. At that moment, I was certain of one thing. My life would no longer be shackled by the past. I was going to build a new family with the person I love. Since finding out I was pregnant, I've become increasingly certain that breaking ties with my parents was the right decision. I want to provide my child with a loving environment, one where they know unconditional love, not exploitation. What if I became like my parents, telling my child to be patient because you're the older sibling or sacrifice for the family? I would never do that. I decided to completely sever the past for the sake of my child. Even thinking of my parents now brings no emotion. Whatever happens to them no longer concerns me. Afterward, Brandon and I enjoyed peaceful days. Max seemed to sense my pregnancy and became even gentler with me. Brandon actively helped around the house and took care of me. One evening, while sitting on the sofa and chatting with Brandon, he suddenly said, "Heather, I'm glad you're happy." I leaned on Brandon's shoulder and quietly replied, "This is the happiest I've ever been." And in my heart, I whispered a wish that our unborn child would also be enveloped in this love. Months into my pregnancy, as my belly slowly grew, I reduced my workload and spent my days with Brandon, thinking of names for our child and preparing baby items. One day, while watching the news, a familiar name flashed on the screen. Elderly couple facing eviction due to unpaid rent. I picked up my smartphone and opened the article. It mentioned my parents' names. According to the article, after losing the lawsuit, my parents had asked Jonathan for help, but he refused to provide any assistance. They eventually fell behind on rent and were about to be evicted from their apartment. I quietly closed the article. It's no longer my concern. The old me might have felt guilty. But the current me is different. My parents chose their path. They were the ones who pushed me away. I placed my smartphone on the table and went out to the terrace where Brandon and Max were. Brandon smiled and looked at me. "Heather, what's wrong?" I smiled as if nothing happened and quietly answered. "Just reminiscing about the past." Brandon didn't ask any more questions and gently took my hand. "I will not return to that past. From now on, I will walk into the future with my beloved family."